The kettle whistled in my quiet kitchen, sunlight catching the roses in my garden. Nothing seemed unusual, yet by noon I stood in a bank lobby, overhearing words that declared me erased from my own life. Grandma story: I surprised my son-in-law at the bank and discovered his cruel secret against me. The morning urge. I woke up that morning with no intention of stepping outside. The light filtering through the curtains was soft, the kind of gentle sunshine that usually makes you want to linger in bed with a book and a second cup of coffee. At my age, mornings are supposed to be slow, steady rituals of toast, a crossword puzzle, maybe a quiet phone call from an old friend. But something in me stirred differently that day. It wasn't fear, it wasn't worry. It was more like a nudge, a whisper just beneath thought, as if an unseen hand on my shoulder was urging me to move. I didn't bother with makeup. My hair was still slightly mussed from sleep, and I slid into the same soft cardigan I wore almost every day, a gray one that had survived years of washing but still wrapped me in comfort. My shoes were the old flats by the door. There was nothing ceremonial about how I dressed, just a woman leaving her house for some errand she couldn't name. Yet deep down I sensed the errand mattered. The drive to the bank was short, barely 7 minutes. I'd driven that route more times than I could count over the decades. Past the row of maple trees that turned crimson in the fall, past the pharmacy where Charles used to pick up my prescriptions, past the little bakery that still sold the same apple turnovers we shared on Saturdays. Each landmark was a memory, stitched into the fabric of my life, yet that morning I hardly noticed them. My hands rested calmly on the wheel, but my mind felt strangely alert, as though anticipating a test I hadn't studied for. When I turned into the bank's parking lot, I noticed how empty it was. For a Thursday morning, that struck me as unusual. I parked, eased the car door shut, and straightened my shoulders. Nothing in me expected what I was about to find. That's the curious thing about life. Its most decisive turns rarely announce themselves. They slip in quietly, disguised as routine. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished floors. The faint hum of computers, the click of heels somewhere down the corridor, and the muted tones of voices behind glass offices, it was all familiar. I had been walking into this same branch for over 30 years. Charles and I opened our first joint account there when we were newly married. We'd signed mortgage papers in one of those rooms, proud and terrified at once. I had walked in holding his hand, believing a bank was a place of safety, a vault not only for money but for trust. And then I saw him. At the far end of the lobby stood a figure I recognized instantly, Michael, my son-in-law. He wore the pale gray suit he usually reserved for special occasions, the kind of attire meant to suggest professionalism, authority, a man with everything under control. He didn't see me enter. He was leaning slightly toward the branch manager, speaking in that calm, polished tone I had heard before when he wanted something. I slowed my steps. Something about the way he held himself felt staged, like a performance rehearsed too many times. I moved closer, quietly, until I was near the tall divider separating the waiting area from the reception desk. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but instinct told me to listen, and then I heard it. "Her name is Margaret Ellis," he said evenly. "She doesn't recognize anyone in the family anymore. Her doctors agree it's progressing quickly. At this point, she's not expected to return to full awareness." My pulse stopped. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if I had misheard. But he repeated my name, my full name, and my world tilted. He was describing me as though I were some vacant shell, a woman slipping irretrievably into confusion. I stood frozen, gripping my purse strap. It felt unreal, like a play in which I had suddenly discovered I was both audience and victim. At that moment, I could have stepped back out the door, convinced myself it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. But another part of me, an older, steadier voice, rose up and said, "Stand still. Watch." I thought of Charles. He had been gone 10 years, but in moments like that I could almost feel his presence. He had always told me, "Don't let anyone speak for you who doesn't fight for you." I remembered his voice, his eyes that never flinched when defending me even against family. So I stayed hidden just long enough to hear Michael continue. He spoke of guardianship, of formalizing accounts, of ensuring my finances were not misused. Each word was a careful blade, slicing away my identity, reducing me to a liability. I touched my wrist to feel my pulse, steady, real, present. I knew where I was. I knew my daughter's laugh, my granddaughter's favorite piano piece, the street where I lived, the faces of my neighbors. I was not lost, I was not gone, and yet here was Michael, weaving a story that buried me alive. It's difficult to explain the cold that spread through me in that moment. Betrayal is not simply pain, it is disorientation. The person you welcomed to your table, the man you trusted with your daughter's happiness, suddenly becomes a stranger wearing a familiar face. That morning in my gray cardigan and old flats, I realized the quiet nudge that had pushed me out of the house was no accident. Something in me had known I needed to see this with my own eyes. I stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, until the sound of my shoes against the polished tile drew their attention. Michael's face drained of color when he saw me. The branch manager blinked twice, startled. I smiled faintly, though my voice when it came out was sharper than the air between us. "Good morning," I said. That was all, 2 simple words, but enough to shatter his performance. The whisper that had stirred me awake had led me here to this moment, and now there was no turning back. A familiar face, a shocking claim. Michael opened his mouth, but no words came. I watched the manager's eyes flick back and forth between us, confusion settling over his features like a cloud. Here he was, caught in the middle of a story that had suddenly cracked in two. On one side, the polished man in a suit presenting himself as the dutiful son-in-law. On the other, me standing tall, alive, clear-eyed, and very much present. "Margaret Ellis," I said, placing my hand lightly on the counter as if to anchor myself. "That's me, and I assure you I am not under medical guardianship, nor am I unaware of who my family is." The words came calmly, but inside I was boiling with a mixture of shock and something else, something sharper. Anger, yes, but also clarity. Betrayal doesn't just sting, it focuses you. It sharpens the edges of your awareness until you see everything with startling precision. Michael stammered, "This isn't what it looks like." I tilted my head, studying him. "Really? Because to me it looks like you just tried to bury me alive while I was still standing." The branch manager coughed awkwardly, then retrieved the folder from Michael's hands and extended it toward me. "I think this belongs to you, ma'am." I accepted it, though my eyes never left Michael's. My hands didn't tremble, though my heart beat a drum roll inside my chest. For a moment I was grateful for the cardigan. It covered the rise and fall of my breath, the signs that I was shaken. Dignity sometimes hides in small mercies like that. As I turned and walked out of the bank, I remembered something else. The first time Michael came into our lives. He had been a nervous young man then, rehearsed and eager. When he asked for my daughter's hand, I had seen in him a hunger to prove himself, to be respected, perhaps even to be admired. But hunger left unchecked can curdle into entitlement. That morning I understood what he truly hungered for: control. I carried the folder like a weight across the parking lot. By the time I reached my car, I had the unsettling sense that I was holding not just paper, but an entire scheme. Carefully crafted in rooms where my voice had not been invited. I slid into the driver's seat and sat for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. Outside, the world looked unchanged: shoppers carrying bags, a mother scolding a child gently near the curb, a delivery truck idling at the stoplight. But for me, nothing was the same. I thought of other seniors I knew, friends from church, neighbors down the street, who had whispered over coffee about children slowly taking over their decisions, about signatures appearing on documents they hadn't fully read, about voices drowned out in the name of help. Some had shrugged, too tired to fight. Others had surrendered, convinced it was inevitable, but I was not ready to surrender. As I sat there, the whisper that had pulled me from my home that morning grew louder in my memory. It wasn't coincidence. Some part of me had known. Call it instinct, call it grace, call it Charles watching over me from wherever he is. I had been guided to witness the lie before it could root itself deeper. Finally, I turned the key and drove. Not home, not yet. Instead, I circled aimlessly through familiar streets. I passed the elementary school where my daughter once carried her lunchbox with pride. I passed the park where my granddaughter now played piano recitals in the summer pavilion. Each landmark reminded me my memory was intact. My life, my history, my awareness, all present, all mine. It is a cruel trick of betrayal that it makes you question yourself first. Sitting at a stoplight, I actually whispered aloud, "I know who I am. I know what day it is, I know my name." Saying it felt like defiance, and in a way it was. When I finally pulled into my driveway, everything looked deceptively ordinary. The hydrangeas drooped against the porch railing, the package I'd ordered leaned against the door. But now my house no longer felt like safe ground. It felt like a stage where lies had been rehearsed behind my back. Inside, I set the folder on the kitchen table. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed too loudly in the quiet house. I sat down, staring at the stamped, notarized papers declaring me mentally incompetent. They hadn't spoken to me, they hadn't asked, they had decided. And that, more than anything, broke something inside me. Not just the betrayal, but the arrogance of it, the assumption that I wouldn't notice, that my silence would be easier than my voice. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my fingertips to my temples. This wasn't just Michael. This was Claire, my own daughter. My mind traveled back to the night she whispered to me, terrified that she might not carry her pregnancy to term, and I had held her until she slept. That same daughter had now signed documents erasing me. It is a strange kind of grief when betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the people whose faces you once kissed goodnight. The papers on the table glared at me like open wounds. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The whisper that led me to the bank that morning had saved my life. But the reckoning had only just begun. The confrontation, when the front door closed behind me that morning, I already knew my home would no longer feel like the same house. Still, it wasn't until I heard the sound of tires crunching into the driveway that the weight of what had happened truly sank in. Claire's car, my daughter. For a moment I allowed myself a fragile hope that maybe she hadn't known, maybe she was innocent of Michael's scheme. But deep down, the silence of the document spoke louder than hope ever could. She walked into the kitchen with her usual casual grace, purse slung over her shoulder, her hair swept up like she was running late but still trying to look composed. "Hi, Mom," she said lightly, her eyes on the counter. "Did you end up going to the—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze landed on the folder, then lifted to me. Her face flickered, not surprise, fear. "Where did you get that?" she asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. "I was at the bank this morning," I said evenly. "Your husband was there too." Her lips parted, then closed again. She rubbed her temple, a nervous habit she had carried since childhood. "Mom, listen, I can explain." "Then try," I replied. She pulled out a chair and sat across from me. For a long moment she stared at the folder as if it might leap up and explain itself on her behalf. Finally she whispered, "This wasn't supposed to happen like this. We just wanted to protect you in case." "In case?" I cut her off. "Claire, those papers don't say in case. They say I'm gone, that I don't recognize you, that I can't make decisions, that I'm under guardianship. That's not protection, that's a burial." Her eyes shimmered, but she stayed silent. "I trusted you," I continued, my voice low but firm. "I let you sit in every doctor's office with me. I gave you the passwords, the documents, the authority to help when I needed it, and you used it to erase me." "I didn't think you'd notice," she said, the words tumbling out like a confession. I laughed once, bitter and short. "Oh, Claire, I notice everything." I leaned forward, tapping the folder gently. "I noticed when Michael stopped calling me Mom and started calling me Ma'am. I noticed when you stopped asking me to babysit Nora, saying she was too much for me. I noticed when the copies of my test results stopped arriving in the mail. And I noticed the way you looked relieved when I didn't show up for Thanksgiving dinner, as if my absence made things easier." Her lips trembled. "That's not true," she whispered. "It is, but what matters more is that you smiled at me, hugged me, sat at this very table, all while signing me away like a car title." Her tears finally fell. She pressed her palms together, whispering, "I didn't know what else to do. You're so strong, Mom. You never ask for help. We thought if something happened, we'd be ready." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You weren't getting ready, you were getting rid of me." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Just then the front door opened again. Michael stepped inside, his voice carrying from the hallway before he even saw us. "Claire, did you—" He stopped short when his eyes fell on the folder spread open across the table. His jaw tightened, then he muttered, "Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag." I stood, "No." The cat was thrown out and she clawed her way back in. Michael raised his hands as if to calm the situation. "Margaret, this isn't personal. Not personal," I snapped. "You told a stranger I was mentally unfit to handle my life. You forged access to my accounts. You tried to erase me, and you call that not personal." He straightened his tie, attempting composure. "We had documentation, medical input. We didn't do this on a whim." "Who filled out those evaluations?" I asked. He hesitated. "Answer me, Michael. We used notes from that memory screening last year," he muttered. "The one I passed, the one where the doctor said I was sharp for my age." His silence was answer enough. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "You didn't do this because I was ill. You did it because I was inconvenient, because I still asked questions, because I didn't hand over everything without a fight." His mask slipped. He sighed, exasperated. "You don't know how exhausting it's been managing everything, helping you, running this house." I laughed, sharp as broken glass. "Exhausting? I raised a daughter for 35 years. I paid for her schooling, her wedding, even your down payment on this house. And now that I want to keep my own voice, I'm suddenly a burden." Neither of them spoke. Claire stared at her lap. Michael clenched his jaw. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. The whisper that led me to the bank that morning had brought me here, to this confrontation, to this breaking point. Betrayal may cut, but it also wakes you up. I realized then they expected me to be too ashamed, too timid, too old to fight back. They were wrong. Papers on the kitchen table. The folder sat on the table like a loaded weapon, daring me to open it again. I had already skimmed the stamped declarations at the bank, but now, in the quiet of my own kitchen, they seemed even heavier. The sun through the window struck the notary seal just so, making it glint like a brand on cattle. My name, my life, was reduced to lines of text. Mentally incompetent. Assets require oversight. Guardianship indefinite. I poured myself a glass of water, though my throat was too tight to drink. I stared at the clear liquid, thinking how absurd it was that the world outside kept moving while mine had just collapsed. Somewhere, neighbors watered their lawns, kids biked down sidewalks. And here I sat, discovering my daughter and her husband had staged a quiet coup against me. I leaned back in my chair and thought of the times Claire had come over in recent months. She'd smile, hug me, chat about Nora's school, then glance quickly at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. I had chalked it up to busyness, to the demands of being a working mother. Now I saw it for what it was: distraction, avoidance. The look of someone carrying a secret too heavy to meet my eyes. I reached for the papers again. The words swam, but the meaning was clear. I hadn't just been betrayed, I had been erased. That's what guardianship meant in their hands. It wasn't a safety net, it was a trap. And worse, they had built it without me even knowing. My mind wandered back to Charles. I could almost hear his voice in that moment. A house isn't just walls, he used to say. It's where people tell you the truth, even when it hurts. Without truth, it's just shelter, not home. If he were alive, I knew he'd be pounding his fist on this very table, demanding answers. Instead, it was me, alone with the echo of his memory and a mountain of betrayal. Then the memory of another woman came to me, an old friend named Helen from church. 2 years ago, she had confessed over coffee that her son had taken control of her finances for her safety. Within months, she was living in a retirement facility she hadn't chosen, her house sold without her knowledge. Her laughter had dimmed, her spirit worn thin. I remembered thinking then I would never let that happen to me. Now, staring at these documents, I realized I was standing on the very same precipice. I thought, too, of the small slights I had brushed aside. The times Michael insisted on handling the taxes, as if I were no longer capable of adding up numbers. The way Claire had begun speaking about the house, like it already belonged to her, dropping casual comments about market value. The whispered conversations that ended the moment I entered the room. Each one had been a thread, and together they had woven the net now sitting in front of me. The glass of water remained untouched. My hands began to tremble, not from weakness but from rage suppressed too long. I pressed them flat against the table to steady myself. I heard the front door creak. Claire's voice called out, light, casual, unknowing. She entered with her usual rhythm, purse on the counter, shoes slipping off by the mat. But when her eyes fell on the folder, the rhythm broke. She froze, and in her silence, in the flicker across her face, I found confirmation. She knew. I didn't need the papers to tell me anymore. Betrayal was written in her hesitation, in her shallow breath, in the way she rubbed her temple like a guilty child. When Michael arrived minutes later, the air shifted again. He saw the papers, saw me, and his practiced calm faltered. Well, he muttered, I guess the cat's out of the bag. No, I replied, my voice cold. The cat wasn't out, it was thrown out, and she clawed her way back in. It was a strange kind of power, standing there between them with the proof of their betrayal laid bare. The kitchen, the same room where birthday cakes were once cut, where homework was done, where Charles and I had whispered about our dreams, had become a courtroom. And I, the woman they had tried to silence, was suddenly the only judge who mattered. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. Instead, I told them calmly, this house may look the same, but it isn't. These papers changed it, you changed it, and from this moment on, nothing between us will ever be the same. As silence settled, I realized something. They had expected me to be too frail to fight. But frailty wasn't in my bones. It wasn't in my blood. What ran through me instead was fire. The same fire that had carried me through loss, through widowhood, through raising a daughter alone when Charles was overseas for months at a time. That fire wasn't gone. It had only been waiting. A daughter's silence. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned pale. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the wall clock above the stove. That clock had measured out countless dinners, late-night talks, and sleepy mornings. Now it measured something else entirely, the seconds stretching between a mother and her daughter, between trust and betrayal. I lowered myself into the chair opposite her, the folder still lying between us like a wedge driven straight into the heart of our family. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, she stared at the papers as though the words on them could rearrange themselves into a kinder truth. "Claire," I said softly but firmly, "you've been sitting across from me for months, smiling, hugging me, asking if I need groceries, and all the while you were signing me away." She winced. "Mom, please," her voice cracked. "It wasn't like that." I leaned forward. "Then tell me, what was it like?" Her lips parted but no words came. She pressed her fingers against her temples as though trying to push out an explanation that would not arrive. Finally, she whispered, "We thought we were protecting you, protecting me." I repeated, tapping the papers with my finger. "These say I'm gone, Claire. These say I don't recognize my own family. That's not protection, that's disappearance." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't think you'd notice," she said, the words barely audible. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Oh, I noticed. I always notice. I noticed when you stopped asking me to babysit Nora. I noticed when Michael started calling me ma'am instead of mom. I noticed when my test results stopped coming to me directly. I noticed the way you looked relieved when I didn't come to Thanksgiving." "That's not true," she whispered quickly, shaking her head. "It is," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Then more quietly, "The worst part isn't the lies, it's that you thought I wouldn't see them." She finally looked up, her eyes glassy, for a flicker of a second. I saw my daughter again, the child who once sat at this very table practicing her multiplication tables, the teenager who cried into my shoulder after her first heartbreak. But that flicker was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the shadow of the woman who had chosen silence over honesty. I thought back to the moments that should have been warnings, when she brushed off my questions about the mail. When she deflected every time I asked why Michael was suddenly so invested in our finances. I had wanted so desperately to believe in her goodness, in the bond we had shared, that I had ignored my own instincts. "Do you know what you've taught your daughter?" I asked quietly. Claire blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "You've taught Nora that betrayal can be disguised as love," I said. "That as long as you smile, it's acceptable to erase someone quietly. That's what she'll remember, your silence while these papers were signed." Her lips trembled. "I didn't know what else to do," she murmured. "You're so strong, Mom. You never ask for help. I thought if something happened, we'd be ready." I shook my head. "You weren't preparing for something. You were preparing for me to disappear. That's not love, Claire. That's convenience." She reached across the table, her hand trembling, but I didn't take it. Some part of me longed to. But the weight of betrayal held me back. A mother's instinct is to comfort, but a betrayed woman's instinct is to protect herself. The front door opened then, and Michael walked in. He glanced at us, then at the folder. His smirk was thin, brittle. "Guess we don't have to pretend anymore," he muttered. Claire dropped her gaze, unable to look at either of us. Her silence filled the room heavier than his arrogance ever could. And in that silence, I realized the truth. Michael might have orchestrated the scheme, but Claire had allowed it, not with her words, but with her silence. That silence had betrayed me more deeply than any lie ever could. I sat back, folding my arms across my chest. "You both made your choice. You chose to act behind my back, and now I'll make mine." Michael frowned, but it was Claire's face that broke me. She looked at me with tears streaming down, as though realizing too late that silence was not a shield but a weapon, and she had wielded it against her own mother. The clock ticked on, measuring the distance growing between us. The son-in-law's defense. Michael leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Eyes narrowed in a way that reminded me of men who mistake bravado for strength. He cleared his throat, as if preparing to lecture me in my own kitchen. "Margaret," he began, using my name like a formality instead of the word mom he once used. "You have to understand how exhausting this has been. We've been running the household, helping with bills, making sure everything stays organized. We weren't trying to hurt you. We were trying to make things easier for everyone." I let his words hang in the air a moment, studying him. That tone, reasonable, measured, laced with self-importance, was his favorite weapon. He wanted the branch manager to hear it, the lawyers to hear it, Claire to hear it. He wanted me to fold under it. But I'd lived long enough to know that a calm voice doesn't always speak the truth. "Easier for everyone," I repeated slowly. "Or easier for you." He flinched just slightly but pressed on. "Look, the medical evaluations said you were at risk. We weren't inventing this. We had notes, signature. The screening last year I cut in. The one I passed, the one where the doctor told me I was sharper than most women my age. Those notes," Michael shifted his weight. Well, context matters. The doctor said sometimes memory issues can worsen quickly, and I raised my hand. Stop, don't twist this. You didn't do this because you were worried about me. You did it because I'm inconvenient, because I don't just sign things and hand them over, because I still ask questions. His lips tightened. You don't know how much we've sacrificed. I lost my job, Claire's been stressed, and you. And I what? I demanded, standing now, my chair scraping against the tile. I raised a daughter for 35 years, paid for her education, her wedding, even gave you the down payment for this house. I covered your family when you couldn't, and now, because I want to keep my own voice, suddenly I'm the burden. He didn't answer. Claire shifted in her seat, tears still on her cheeks, but she said nothing. Her silence was permission, and Michael knew it. I took a breath, steadying myself. The anger was real, but so was the clarity. This wasn't just about a legal document, it was about power. Michael had found a way to cloak greed in responsibility, ambition in care. I thought of my own father then. He was a quiet man, but once when a neighbor tried to swindle him out of land, I saw him stand tall and say, "You can lie to anyone you want, but not to the man who remembers planting every tree on that acre." I remembered the steel in his voice, the way truth gave him backbone, and now decades later I felt that same steel in mine. "You stood in a bank," I said to Michael, my voice sharp, "and told a stranger that I no longer recognized my own daughter. You lied, and you lied with confidence. That isn't exhaustion, that's ambition, that's theft," with a smile. Michael uncrossed his arms, pacing now. "You're twisting everything. Do you think it's easy for me? I've been carrying this family. Do you have any idea how hard?" I cut him off again, louder this time. "Do not talk to me about carrying this family. You married into it. You walked into a life I had already built, a home I had already maintained. You don't get to call that a burden just because it doesn't bend to your will." He stopped pacing, jaw tight, and for the first time I saw the mask slip. His voice lost its measured calm. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. "No," I said evenly, meeting his glare without blinking. "I think the mistake was ever believing you saw me as anything more than an obstacle to what you wanted." The silence that followed was thick. Claire wiped her eyes but still didn't speak. Michael looked at her, waiting for her to defend him. She didn't, and in that space I felt the ground shift. I had spent weeks, maybe months, questioning myself, wondering if I was too forgetful, too dependent, too old-fashioned. But in that moment, watching Michael sputter under the weight of his own excuses, I knew the truth. I wasn't the one who had lost clarity. They had. And clarity is a weapon sharper than any lie, reclaiming the voice. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was anxious and not even because I was angry. It was something different, an alertness I hadn't felt in years, as though some wire in me that had gone cold was suddenly alive again. I sat in my armchair, the one by the fireplace Michael had smugly referred to as your little corner, as if I were just a piece of furniture in my own home. But I didn't feel small anymore. I felt awake. By dawn I had made my decision. I would no longer let them speak for me. I would reclaim my voice, not just with words but with action. At 8 o'clock sharp, I dialed my attorney, the same one who had handled Charles's will after he passed. The poor man hadn't heard from me in years, but when he picked up and heard the edge in my tone, he knew this wasn't a courtesy call. "Margaret," he said gently, "what's happened?" "Betrayal," I replied, "and I need your help to undo it." The second call I made was to a financial advisor Charles and I had trusted years ago. I told him what had happened, that I wanted a forensic audit of every transaction tied to Michael and Claire's names in the last year. There was a pause on the other end, and then a firm "understood." By noon I had canceled every automatic transfer linked to Michael's business account. By 1 I had changed every password to every online login, and by 3:15 I was sitting in my attorney's office unfolding the folder they never expected me to see. He read in silence for several minutes, then looked up at me. "Do you want to press charges?" "Not yet," I said. "But I do want a full record, every signature, every date, every statement, and I want a new will, no half measures, complete rewrite." His pen hovered. "And your beneficiary?" "My granddaughter," I said. "She's 12, still honest for now. Set up a trust with condition. As for Claire and Michael, they're out of everything." He nodded, writing quickly. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the respect due a woman who knew her own mind. When I left his office that day, I walked down the steps lighter than I had in years, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because I had chosen to fight back. My voice was mine again. Driving home, I remembered moments from my past when speaking up had changed everything. I remembered being a young mother in the 1970s, challenging a school board that wanted to cut music programs. I remembered standing at Charles's side when he fought for fair pay at the factory. I remembered telling my own mother I would marry for love, not for arrangement, even when she frowned. Each time my voice had carved a path forward. I realized then that silence ages a person faster than time ever could. Silence is what had crept into me the last few years. The way I'd swallowed small slights, ignored whispers, brushed aside red flags. I had mistaken endurance for peace. But endurance without boundaries is not peace, it's erasure. That evening when I returned home, Michael and Claire were waiting for me in the living room. Michael was pacing like he owned the place, Claire perched on the couch. Hands folded tight, he barked before I even set my purse down. "Why did you cut the account?" I didn't flinch. I placed my bag on the table and faced them both. "I went to my lawyer today," I said evenly. Claire's face paled, Michael's jaw tightened. "And here's what's going to happen next," I continued. Michael scoffed. "You're bluffing." "No," I said, "I'm reclaiming what was always mine. I'm filing a statement revoking all guardianship attempts permanently. Legally, retroactively, and the will has already been rewritten." He laughed, sharp and bitter. "You don't even know how." "Oh, I know exactly how," I replied, stepping closer. "Because while you were busy trying to act like the responsible son-in-law, you left a paper trail so sloppy a third-year law student could tear it apart." For once he had no comeback. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears again, but this time I didn't soften. I had found my footing. "You thought age meant weakness," I told them. "It doesn't. You thought silence meant surrender. It doesn't. And you thought betrayal would go unnoticed. It didn't." The room was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat, strong and steady. And in that silence I knew my voice was not only reclaimed, it was unshakable. The attorney's office. The following morning I was back at my lawyer's office, folder in hand, resolve in my chest. The building was old brick, with ivy curling up its walls, steady, dependable, much like the man I had trusted for decades. Inside, the smell of leather and paper carried a kind of reassurance. I wasn't here as a victim anymore. I was here as a client with a case. He ushered me into the conference room where polished oak stretched the length of the space. He adjusted his glasses and gestured for me to sit. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've reviewed what you brought yesterday. It's not just sloppy, it's reckless. They left signatures mismatched, dates inconsistent. Any judge worth his robe would tear this apart in minutes." I exhaled slowly. It was one thing to feel betrayed. It was another to know I wasn't crazy, that the law itself could see the holes in their scheme. "I don't want revenge," I told him. "But I want it recorded permanently that I was never incompetent. I want a statement filed. I want the bank notified, and I want every thread of their access pulled apart." He nodded. "We'll revoke everything, retroactively. The records will show their actions were invalid." He flipped a page in his notebook. "And the will, how far do you want to go?" "All the way," I said, my voice didn't even tremble. "Claire and Michael are out. My granddaughter gets the trust with conditions. She's still young enough to know honesty matters." The pen scratched quickly against paper. "And the house, my house remains mine until the day I can no longer stand in it," I answered firmly. "No shortcuts, no guardianship. I decide when I'm done, not them." As he worked, I found myself remembering moments with Charles again. He had always said, "Paper protects the living when words are forgot." He wasn't wrong. These papers, twisted by Michael, had been meant to erase me. Now, with the same ink and signatures, I was writing myself back in. When we finished, my attorney slid a fresh folder toward me. "This is your will, updated today, no ambiguity. If something ever happens, your wishes are clear. Until then, no one speaks for you but you." I ran my hand across the folder, feeling the embossed lettering of his firm's name. Relief washed over me, not the weak kind that comes from escape, but the strong kind that comes from reclaiming ground you thought was lost. Walking out into the sunlight, I realized the irony. Yesterday I had been declared mentally unfit. Today, I had orchestrated more legal protection in 4 hours than Michael had in all his posturing. Age hadn't made me weaker, it had made me sharper, because I knew what truly mattered couldn't be stolen with a signature. On the drive home, I thought of others like me, friends who had told me about relatives circling like vultures, waiting for one slip of memory to seize control. I remembered a woman from church who lost her home because her son claimed she forgot a payment that she had in fact mailed. I remembered a neighbor whose niece took over her accounts only for the money to vanish. I realized then that my fight wasn't just mine, it was theirs too. My story might end differently because I caught them in time, but too many don't, and that thought filled me with both sorrow and determination. When I pulled into my driveway, Claire's car was already there. She and Michael were waiting inside as though the house were still theirs to command. Michael jumped to his feet when I walked in. "What did you do?" he demanded. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I placed my new folder, the one bearing my attorney's embossed seal, on the table. The sound of it landing was deliberate, final. What I should have done the moment you lied to that bank manager, I said. I rewrote everything, and from this day forward, neither of you has a single claim to my name, my accounts, or my home. Michael's face darkened, Claire's eyes brimmed again, but for the first time I wasn't looking at them with grief. I was looking at them with clarity. This house has always been built on truth, I said quietly. You tried to strip that away with silence and signatures, but truth stands longer than lies. I didn't wait for their reply. I had spoken. My voice had filled the house again, stronger than it had been in years, and this time I knew it would not be silenced. Eviction notice. It was almost surreal how ordinary the house looked that evening, even as everything inside it had changed. The same couch, the same photographs on the mantel, the same quilt folded neatly over the arm of my chair. Yet when I walked into the living room carrying the freshly prepared letter from my attorney, I felt like I was standing on the threshold of a different world. Michael was pacing by the fireplace, phone in hand, his voice raised. Claire sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes swollen from tears. They both froze when they saw the letter in my hands. "What is that?" Michael demanded. I placed it on the table with a deliberate tap. "It's a formal 30-day eviction notice from my attorney. You'll both be out by the end of next month." Claire's voice cracked. "Mom, you're kicking us out?" I looked at her steadily. "No, you removed yourselves the moment you stood in a bank and told strangers I was mentally gone. All I'm doing is confirming it." Michael's face twisted with indignation. "We supported you. We lived here rent-free because you said you wanted us close. I cut him off, my voice sharper than he expected. "I paid the utilities, the groceries, the taxes. I kept the lights on and the roof over your heads, and every time you spoke of future plans, they somehow always involved my house. That's not support, that's exploitation." The silence that followed was heavy. Claire's hands trembled in her lap. She looked younger than her years in that moment. More like the child who once begged me to let her stay up past bedtime than the woman who had just tried to erase me with her signature. "Where are we supposed to go?" she whispered finally. "Somewhere that teaches you to respect a roof that isn't yours," I replied evenly. Michael's jaw tightened. "You're punishing your daughter because of me." I turned toward him with a cold smile. "No, I'm holding you both accountable. She married you. She signed with you. She stayed silent with you, and silence is a choice." He scoffed, but I pressed on. "You think this is about money or property. It isn't. It's about trust, and trust doesn't live here anymore, not for either of you." For a moment Claire looked as though she might argue, might reach across the widening canyon between us, but instead she lowered her gaze, tears dripping onto her hands. Michael muttered something under his breath and looked away. I stood taller than I had in years. For so long I had let their presence shrink me, confine me to my little corner by the fireplace. But now, with that eviction notice on the table, I felt the walls of the house expand again. My home was mine once more. That night when I sat in bed, I expected loneliness to wash over me. After all, I was sending away my only daughter, her husband, the family I had built around myself. But instead, I felt a surprising calm. The house was quiet, yes, but for the first time in months, it was honest. I thought back to when Charles and I bought this house. We had stood in the empty living room, our voices echoing off bare walls, dreaming aloud about birthday parties, Christmas mornings, long Sunday afternoons. He had said to me, "This house will be our fortress, Margaret. As long as truth lives here, nothing can take it away." And now, decades later, I was protecting that fortress, not with bricks and mortar, but with boundaries and courage. The next morning, when I came down for breakfast, the letter was still there on the table. Its presence was a reminder I had drawn the line. And once a line is drawn, you do not erase it, you walk forward from it. For the first time in a long time, I buttered my toast slowly, poured my coffee deliberately, and felt something unexpected rise inside me. Peace born of resolve, the granddaughter's trust. Claire's sobs had faded into silence by the time I opened the side drawer and pulled out a smaller folder. Michael leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, his face set in stone. He thought I was bluffing, that all this would collapse into some emotional plea for reconciliation. But when I placed the slim folder on the table, his composure cracked. "This," I said, sliding it toward Claire, "is a trust created today in Nora's name." Claire blinked through her tears, then glanced down at the folder as though it might burn her hands if she touched it. "For Nora," she whispered. "Yes," I replied. "It's modest but real. It will grow with her. And it is separate. She's 12. And she isn't responsible for your decisions. She will learn from them for better or worse, but she won't be punished for them." Michael sneered. "So now you're the hero." "No," I said firmly, meeting his glare. I'm simply a woman who stopped apologizing for having boundaries. You tried to strip away my choices, but what you forgot is that I still have the power to protect the one person who still deserves it." Claire clutched the folder, her fingers trembling. For the first time in days, she seemed to really look at me, not as someone fading, not as a liability, but as her mother. Her lips parted, but no words came. "You know what hurts most?" I asked quietly. "Not that you lied, not that you signed papers behind my back, but that you made me feel small in my own home. You made me feel like I should be grateful just to still exist here." Claire's face crumpled. "I lost sight," she said softly. "We were drowning, and it felt easier to prepare for your absence than to face our failures." I nodded slowly. "That's the first honest thing you've said in months." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't empty either. It was full of something unspoken, a recognition that while forgiveness might not come soon, truth had at last been named. Michael shifted, his mouth opening as if to argue, but I raised my hand. "No more speeches, no more excuses. The trust is proof of where my loyalty lies. Nora will have a future unshackled by your schemes, and the rest of this family. That depends on whether you learn to live without deceit." I remembered then the times I had sat with Nora, listening to her halting attempts at piano, her small fingers pressing wrong keys with such determination. Each time she stumbled, she looked at me for reassurance, and I always told her the same thing. "Mistakes don't define you, darling. How you correct them does." That was why I created the trust, not because I needed to punish Claire or Michael, but because I needed to leave Nora something more than money. I needed to leave her a lesson that honesty and dignity are worth protecting, even when those closest to you fail. Claire held the folder against her chest as though it might steady her heartbeat. For a brief second, her eyes flicked to Michael, but she quickly looked away. She knew that everything she had signed away in silence was now set in stone in a different way, through my choice, not hers. Michael muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." I turned to him with a calm that surprised even me. "No, the only regret I have is not seeing it sooner." That night, when the house finally fell quiet, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. On the first blank page, I wrote, "A trust is not only money, it is a declaration of who deserves faith. Today I declared mine." I closed the book and tucked it away, knowing one day Nora might find it. And when she did, she would know that even when her mother and father faltered, her grandmother stood firm. The trust wasn't just financial. It was symbolic, a bridge to the future, anchored in the truth that had nearly been stolen but was now reclaimed. Peace restored. 27 days later, the moving truck pulled up. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no neighbors gathering to watch a family unravel. Just boxes carried out one by one, the quiet thud of tape stretched across cardboard, the shuffle of feet leaving a place they once believed was theirs. Nora hugged me tighter than usual before she left. "Can I still come visit, Grandma?" she whispered. "Of course," I said, smoothing her hair. "This will always be your home." Claire lingered at the doorway, purse clutched like a shield. Her eyes were red, her face drawn. "I don't expect forgiveness," she murmured, "but I'm going to earn back your trust." I tilted my head slightly. "Then I'll leave the porch light on." She managed a faint smile, tired but real, and then she was gone. When the last box disappeared, I stood in the living room listening to the silence. For the first time in years, it didn't feel sharp or heavy. It felt clean, peaceful. I opened the windows and let the evening air drift in. The house breathed with me again. Later, I made tea and settled into my armchair. No longer my little corner, it was once again the center of my home. The quiet around me wasn't emptiness, it was freedom. I thought about everything that had unfolded, the betrayal, the confrontation, the legal battles, the eviction. And through it all, one truth shone brighter than the rest. No one has the right to take away your voice. Not a spouse, not a child, not anyone. Your story is yours to tell until your last breath. I opened my journal and wrote a note, folding it carefully into the front cover. "Let no one speak for you who wouldn't fight for you." If one day Nora found it, she'd know the lesson had been written not by lawyers, not by courts, but by life itself. I thought of Charles and how he used to remind me that age was not weakness but proof of endurance. He would have been proud of me for standing tall, for reclaiming not only my name but my dignity. Yes, my family had fractured. Yes, there was pain, but there was also renewal. Boundaries are a kind of love too, the kind that teaches others where respect must begin. That night, with the windows open and the house finally mine again, I realized peace had returned. Not the peace of avoidance, not the silence of being diminished, but the true peace that comes from knowing you defended yourself when it mattered most. And if age had taught me anything, it was this: peace is not given, peace is claimed. This story began with something as small as a whisper, an unexplainable urge to visit the bank. That simple decision unraveled a web of betrayal that had been carefully spun behind closed doors. What Margaret discovered was more than just legal paperwork. It was the chilling realization that her daughter and son-in-law had tried to erase her voice, her identity, her very presence. The confrontation in the bank, the painful silence of her daughter, and the arrogant excuses of her son-in-law revealed a truth many elders fear: that love can be twisted into convenience. That protection can be used as a mask for control. Yet instead of surrendering, Margaret chose to fight. She reclaimed her agency through action, canceling accounts, rewriting her will, meeting her lawyer with clear instructions, and creating a trust to protect the one innocent person left in the storm, her granddaughter. Each step became more than a defense. It was a declaration that age is not weakness, that awareness cannot be dismissed, and that dignity cannot be quietly signed away. The eviction notice was painful but necessary, drawing a boundary that transformed her house back into a home. And when the boxes were carried out, Margaret found that silence could feel peaceful again, not oppressive. The lesson is simple yet profound. No one should ever allow another person to speak on their behalf unless that person would also fight for them. Betrayal may wound, but it also sharpens clarity. For seniors facing similar fears, Margaret's story is both a warning and a beacon. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of truth. And truth, once reclaimed, restores not only a home but a life. The house is quiet now, sunlight soft across the rocking chair, my coffee cooling on the table. Age does not mean silence. We deserve joy, dignity, and respect. Tell me where you're watching from and join me for the next story.